All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the last session of the first day of the e-conference. I will be chairing this session, but Raphael Krut-Landau, my Dr. Bruder, is going to be leading the session, presenting a paper called The Middle Standpoint in Spinoza's Ethics. So take it away, we'll show the video first.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to give you a brief overview of my paper, Spinoza's Middle Standpoint. The paper addresses a well-known problem. Spinoza seems to be committed to an inconsistent triad. The first claim in the triad is, necessarily each mind is not eternal, and it's subject to passions. The second claim is, each mind can become eternal, in part by remedying all its passions. And the third claim in the triad is, necessarily each mind already is eternal. Now, clearly these three claims are inconsistent. Actually, it's even worse than that. At most, one of these claims can be true. And my contention, and this is not by any means unique to me or new, is that these three claims are not advanced as true, period, but they're true for different perspectives. That's not new. What's new in this paper is that I try to clarify what the nature of these perspectives really is. And so I philosophize about the perspectives and also try to put them into some historical context. So what are the different perspectives that Spinoza uses to do philosophy? I count three. And the first two are very well known. The third on this slide is, I think, a contentious contribution that I'm making. Number one, there is the perspective of eternity, or eternal perspective, as I'm going to call it. Then there's the perspective of time, or the temporal perspective. Finally, in part 5 of the Ethics, in a passage that really deserves our attention, translated actually better by George Eliot than I think by Curley, part 5, proposition 31 scholium, Spinoza introduces the idea of a shifting perspective, or middle perspective. This is the standpoint of somebody who is switching from the temporal perspective to the eternal perspective. So we've got three perspectives. This can help us rescue Spinoza from inconsistency. He seems to be committed to the claim that the mind is non-eternal. I call that claim T. However, his commitment to that claim flows from the axiom of part 4, and Spinoza clarifies in part 5 that this axiom concerns singular things insofar as they are related to time. He's suggesting that that axiom isn't an account of what things are like, period, or objectively. It's a characterization of what things are like from the perspective of time. So what I suggest is that Spinoza's commitment to T, it's really a commitment to the claim that T is true for the perspective of time. I offer an analogous diagnosis of his claim that we can become eternal and remedy our passions and turn our inadequate ideas to adequate ideas. What I suggest is that when Spinoza says that we can remedy the passions, he's speaking from the shifting perspective. And this is signaled by the language of part 5, proposition 3, where he says, in my translation, a passion ceases to be a passion as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. Curley has as soon as we form, but the Latin doesn't force that on us whatsoever. So what he's saying there is, look, as we shift perspectives, passions fade away. It's sort of like saying blurry things stop being blurry as we focus the camera. And finally, according to this initial solution, and I'm going to make this a little bit more complicated in a second, Spinoza endorses those first two claims there and also the claim that the mind is necessarily eternal. But there's a problem, and we need to make this solution more nuanced. The problem is that the temporal perspective itself is composed of non-eternal ideas. So if claim E is true, it would follow that all ideas are eternal, and so the temporal perspective wouldn't exist. It's even worse than that. If all ideas are eternal, then we can't claim that the mind is temporally finite, nor can we say that that claim is merely temporally true, because the temporal perspective doesn't exist, nor can we retreat and just say that that claim that the mind is temporally true is merely temporally true, because again, we're committing ourselves to the objective existence of a temporal perspective. But we can iterate this infinitely many times. In other words, if you were to say, and I know this may seem a little bit ridiculous and it may induce a kind of philosophical nausea, but nevertheless, if you were to say that T is just temporally true, or rather that that claim is just temporally true, or rather everything I just said is just temporally true, or rather at least everything I've just said is temporally true, and so on ad infinitum, what you would get is a claim which is compatible with E, because it never commits you to claiming that the temporal perspective exists, only that it exists for itself. So that leads to the following revised solution. T, remember T is the claim that the mind is temporally finite and necessarily subject to passions. That claim is temporally true, or at least that's temporally true, or at least that's temporally true, so on to infinity. But then we have to reckon with the following question. does Spinoza think that any perspectives are objectively correct? And I think the evidence here is mixed. If Spinoza says no, in other words, if he's a kind of relativist, then he's got to embrace a similar claim about E and the eternal perspective. He's got to claim that E is not true simplicator, but it's eternally true, or rather that claim is eternally true, or rather everything I just said is eternally true, and so on ad infinitum. There's two options. We can either say that the third claim we're attributing to him is this infinitely iterated one, or we can simply say that he endorses E, that he, in other words, that he thinks the mind literally is necessarily eternal, period, and that there are these self-embedded perspectives for which the mind is, in one case, temporal, and in the other case, capable of becoming eternal.
All right, does anyone have any questions? If you do, use the raise hand function. So I know. All right, so Hassa, you're up.
Second. Hello. So I'm first this time. Well, okay, so my question is I'm not sure whether it's primitive, but let me say it nevertheless. So I was thinking that very few people would say that there is contradiction between these things, because it's very well known that Spinoza allows many perspectives, and things appear differently from different perspectives, even though every perspective has a comprehensive view of the whole. But in your paper itself, not in this presentation, you suggested that there is such an interpretation that claims that Spinoza is something like perspective relativists. But then I do not see actually how Spinoza could be perspective relativist, because the very fact that the human perspective of perceiving the world is limited by time, it makes it simply in a way imperfect in comparison to the divine perspective that can contain infinitely many perspectives in itself. So it seems that any other perspective then it is infinitely imperfect in comparison to the divine perspective. So there is no possibility for any sort of relativist, because of course sub specie aeternitatis, it is the most perfect of all perspectives, most complete, because it's infinite in its modes. So I would like to learn more about this perspective relativist interpretation that you presented, and do you consider it at all plausible?
Also, what a great question! Thank you so much.
Yes,
I think it's a great thing to ask about. So first of all I say is that he may or may not be a relativist, and I consider both possibilities. I do think that there's more evidence for the relativist interpretation than is usually granted. The main evidence for this position is that for him, there's a very close connection between existing and being conceived. There's also a very close connection between existing and having aspects. And for example, he says, the more something exists, the more attributes it has. So there's a correlation. The more something exists, the more attributes it has, the less it exists, the fewer attributes it has. What is responsible for this correlation? Well, one natural answer is this isn't just a contingent correlation. It is grounded in the fact that to exist is to have aspects. That's why you exist more when you have more aspects. To exist is to have aspects. In other words, that to exist is to exist for a perspective. That was a little quick. What's needed there is an explanation of the relationship between aspects and perspectives. But once that relationship is clarified, premise, to exist is to have aspects. Second premise, to have an aspect is to be a certain way for a certain perspective. Conclusion, to exist is to exist for one or more perspectives. And the hypothesis I'm toying with, and it needs development for sure, is that our notion of objectivity is just a little alien to Spinoza. He doesn't need it. There's God's perspective, and there's the ordinary one. but there's no need to posit some kind of perspective-independent truth. It doesn't enter into his head even to posit it. And that's why we see this tight connection between existence and conception.
All right.
Thank you very much, Rafi. This went by a little fast for me, but my question in the end is, what exactly does a perspective mean? What does it mean to be a perspective? And I think the idea of a transitional perspective is a very interesting one. Clearly, Spinoza talks about some things as being temporal, some other things as being eternal, and looking at some things either temporally or sub specie eternitatis.
Yeah.
But what do these perspectives really come down to?
I think that's the right question to ask. For me, a perspective is a set of ideas. So the perspective of eternity is God's intellect. It's the set of all adequate ideas. The perspective of time is a set of different ideas. It's a set of inadequate ideas. You know, we imagine that things come to be at certain times and pass out of existence at other times. From God's point of view, none of that happens, but those events do occur from this ordinary perspective. The problem is the ordinary perspective is itself composed of inadequate ideas, and those ideas do not exist from God's perspective. And that's what leads me to complicate the story and introduce the idea of infinitely nested perspectives.
Right. Now, but to continue just a little bit on this, where do you put the Pythagorean theorem?
So the Pythagorean theorem is an omnipresent property of the kind described in part 2, proposition 38, I think. Spinoza's, yeah. And then there's an adequate idea of that property. Yeah. I don't know if that's a detailed enough account of.
Oh, no. I mean, you have these two different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Is it in one realm or the other realm, or in a certain way in both? Because it is obviously when you've gone through Euclid, you have an adequate idea of the Pythagorean theorem. That adequate idea is, in a certain way, temporal, but it's also something that is, after all, an eternal truth. And what I'm thinking about now is the Scholium 2 Ethics 5 proposition 23, which is, if anything is transitional from, the temporal to the eternal, his remarks there that demonstrations are the eyes of the mind by which we perceive. We feel, sentimus, the eternal.
Those are some really interesting passages and much beloved. There's a few points you're making. One is that, and this is something that Kristin has also wrestled with in her work, is given that we're temporal beings, what happens when we do math? How does Spinoza represent eternal facts to beings that are in time? I think that in the background of his engagement with that problem is the views that mathematicians have taken toward that kind of problem. So one traditional view is that in order to wrestle with eternal facts about triangles, we create temporal proxies. We draw pictures, and geometrical constructions give us temporal beings a kind of access to these eternal truths. So we use temporal analogs in order to understand eternal things. So to understand an eternal triangle.
I would resist that. I would resist that, and let me say what I've been wrestling with, which is just a little bit different than that, but not unrelated. which is the idea in Ethics 5 that the more of these adequate ideas, eternal truths, knowledge of the second and third kind that we get, the more of our mind is eternal. Which is to say that our mind, insofar as it's a combination, or it's a collection of ideas, some of which are adequate, some of which are inadequate, is a collection of things that is partly eternal and partly temporal, which suggests that the adequate ideas in some way or another are standing in both places. I'm not sure what this says about perspectives, but this is the complication that I find extremely puzzling. And the more of the adequate ideas that you get, the greater part of you is eternal, at the same time as being, at least in part, temporal.
This could go on. This is a very rich topic. We'll have to circle
Okay,
back
I'm
to
sorry.
it. No, it's
very
fine,
sorry.
Dan. No,
I'm
no,
very sorry.
no. Colin Chamberlain is next, but we can always return to the knots at the end of part 5. But take it away, Colin.
Thanks. My connection is not great, so I apologize if it cuts out or whatever. So I want to ask you how exactly you're seeing the indexing to perspectives as removing the contradiction or the inconsistency here, because there are a few ways in which you can understand sort of like qual language. Like you could see saying like quad temporal as being more fine-grained about the subject of predication. You could see it as being more fine-grained about like the predicates, in which case the putatively inconsistent properties would actually be like relational properties that things have only in relation to a perspective. And some of the stuff you said in response to Dan makes me think this might be your view, to say that like some claim is true from a perspective is just to say that that claim is represented by that perspective, that the idea of that claim is included in that perspective. So I'm sort of curious, like, which way do you want to go here? Like, how exactly do you want to spell out the machinery of these perspectives?
Colin, thanks. It's a great, really two questions. One is, how do I understand aspects? And I would go for the view that the Quay language specifies the subject, specifies the entity, not the relation or property. In the paper, I say, I think Julie Klein's view is right here. So Julie Klein says, aspects exhibit simultaneous sameness and difference. So you have multiple aspects, and they are all one and the same thing, and yet they differ. They're the same, but they differ. And that's because sameness and identity are not the same thing. So you qua temporal, that's one of your aspects. You qua eternal, that's another one of your aspects. And those are one and the same thing, but they have all kinds of different properties and they can differ without contradiction. It's a little bit like time slices. So you on Sunday and you on Monday are in some clear sense one and the same thing, but of course they can have different properties. I'm not saying Spinoza believes in time slices, but if you understand that concept, then I think it can give you a grip on his notion of an aspect. For me, perspectival talk and aspectual talk are really just two ways of describing the same thing. I'm glad you've nudged me to make that commitment explicit, because I think I hadn't quite made it explicit to myself. The second point you raise is, well, to say that P is true for a certain perspective, is that just to say that that perspective represents that claim as true? I want to say yes. I think that by saying yes, I'm going to walk into some kind of trap, but I'll stride forth into that trap. In other words, maybe there are some implications that I'll trigger by saying this, but I do think that really there are just appearances. as it were. And that's the point Hasse was pushing me on, that really there's good evidence that Spinoza is a kind of relativist. There are just appearances. And then, of course, he needs to account for the reality of the appearances themselves, and that leads to infinite regresses, which I think in the end are virtuous.
Follow-ups to this exchange?
So,
other questions? Oh, yeah.
I guess maybe I'll just respond. That's super helpful. I was expecting you to choose one of the three options, and you went for two, and that's kind of cool. So, like, what it is to have a property relative to a perspective is just to have an aspect that has that property, and have an aspect that has a certain property is just to be represented as having that property from some collection of ideas that constitutes a perspective.
I should say if you look at, there's a nice piece by Andreas Schmidt where he talks about the formal distinction in Spinoza, and there he points out that the formal distinction in scholasticism makes clear that this is a distinction that arises ex parte rei. In other words, it's not created by the mind. So in other words, you qua temporal and you qua eternal are really distinct, and that distinction would be there even if no one noticed. You qua professor and you qua sibling and you qua citizen are all genuinely distinct, and that distinction arises in you independently of the mind. So if you think that Spinoza is wielding a traditional formal distinction, in other words, also called an aspectual distinction, then you'll have to resist what I said earlier, which is that that in some sense to have an aspect is just to look a certain way to a perspective. So maybe I should sort of withhold judgment on that question, because it seems like the evidence is a little bit mixed.
So Colin in the comments just asked a question. Did you want to just...
I want to take a moment to read it. I'm going to need a couple hours here, Colin, sorry. X is F relative to G. Yeah, I think that's what I committed myself to earlier. And I think it's such a good question because you've kind of forced me to make my views explicit here. And I'm not sure whether I want to say that aspects are so mind dependent. Perhaps the different perspectives just notice different aspects, but those aspects would be there even if no one noticed them.
All right, Anne-Marie Butler.
Make sure that I'm tracking this, sorry. I'm losing my grip on what the shifting perspective is. I've got the temporal, or what it is for, so let me see if I've got this right. Is it that the temporal is when I, as a finite mind, try to think of other finite things that are also in the temporal order, and then the eternal things are eternal, and then is the shifting me as a mind trying to grasp the eternal? Is that where, so I'm trying to wed the perspective talk. I think I might be finding the perspective talk unhelpful, actually. But is that what generates this third perspective? So eternal is eternal simplicator, temporal is temporal as conceived within the temporal order, and then you get this third perspective because there's this marrying of the two.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So the text that makes me think there's a middle perspective is part 5, proposition 31, Scholium. There he says, the mind is eternal. I've just proven this. Nevertheless, for an easier explanation and better understanding of the things we wish to show, we shall consider it as though it were beginning to be and beginning to understand things under the aspect of eternity. What a claim. One thing I point out in the paper is it looks very much as though he's quoting Proclus. This is actually something that Ben Morrison discovered, or kind of uncovered. in the middle of my dissertation defense. He's like, oh, that sounds like Proclus. So I think, yeah, Proclus says that according to an old Platonist view, when you create a geometrical construction, you are taking something eternal as though it were coming to be. What does Spinoza say in Part 5, Proposition 31 Scholium? Well, for didactic reasons, because it'll be easier for you to understand, I'm going to characterize something eternal as though it were temporal, as though it were coming, as though it were not only temporal, but as though it were becoming eternal. I'm being a little quick here. So what he actually says there is that we're going to consider the mind as though it were adopting the perspective of eternity. So we're considering the mind as though it were shifting towards the perspective of eternity. So that's the perspective that I mean, the perspective that we're imagining the mind to take.
Replies to that? Is that
I don't know if that was
helpful?
clear. I could also try to say it again more concisely.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
Is the perspective then, I was thinking of the perspective as something that the philosopher occupies when considering, for example, temporal things, or when considering, say, God, and eternal things like the immediate infinite modes. But you're talking about the perspective as something that each of us as a mind occupies, as we're either contemplating temporal things or considering, say, eternal truths. And if that's the case, I'm just wondering what you need the sort of intermediate stage for. If I'm thinking about my desk, that's temporal. If I'm thinking about the Pythagorean Theorem, that's eternal. The becoming, consider it as beginning to be eternal, means I'm beginning to, as I read that passage in P31 Scholium, I am learning eternal truths, which then makes now a certain part of my mind eternal. Why do you need the intermediate one? If it's us that is occupying these different perspectives.
I think I'd need to learn more about the context of your reading in order to fully understand where you're coming from. It seems as though in that scholium, he's saying there is a certain perspective from which, sorry, let me begin again. What he's saying is we can imagine the mind as shifting from an ordinary perspective towards the perspective of eternity. So that mind itself is taking a certain vantage point on the world. It is seeing things as shifting from temporal to eternal. That mind itself is shifting from being temporal to being eternal. And when we consider such a mind, we are ourselves shifting from being temporal to being eternal.
Chris Noble, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, real quick. Thanks, Rafi. I just wonder if you ever think that we actually ever fully occupy one perspective or the other. So in other words, do we ever fully occupy something like a temporal perspective? Or are we always sort of mixed, let's say somewhere between sort of seeing some things inadequately under the aspect of duration versus seeing things more adequately under the aspect of eternity. So guys, do we ever sort of fully occupy one perspective or the other?
I think I am simultaneously temporal and eternal. I have a temporal side, my imagination, and I have an eternal side, my intellect. These are different aspects of me, And so in that sense, I simultaneously see things as temporal and see things as eternal. And so in that sense, I can simultaneously grasp the Pythagorean theorem as an eternal truth, but I can also grasp it from a more ordinary perspective. And that's what Spinoza says in the discussion of the three kinds of knowledge. A single mathematical truth can be conceived in different ways. A single person could grasp that truth in several simultaneous ways because you're a multifaceted being. But I want to be clear, it's not that I think that part of the mind is temporal and part of the mind is eternal. Instead, these are different aspects of the same mind. And that might be a difference between me and Dan Garber's reading. I think Dan wants to say that part of the mind is temporal, and this is sort of like a Mariological part. In other words, the mind is an aggregate of ideas, some of which are inadequate, some of which are adequate. In my view, the mind is conceivable as a bundle of inadequate ideas, but also conceivable as a bundle of adequate ideas. So there's an aspectual distinction between the imagination and the intellect. One reason to go my way is that when Spinoza characterizes an adequate idea, he characterizes adequacy as a feature of an aspect of an idea. An idea is adequate insofar as it is conceived in a certain way. So that very same idea can also be conceived as inadequate. And adequate and inadequate ideas are two sides of the same coin.
I think I'm going to insert myself in the queue right now. So let me see if I have this straight. So on your picture, you've got a mind, your human mind, that has some ideas which are inadequate and confused, perceptual, imaginative ideas, etc. Then you have adequate ideas, and these, it's the nature of these to consider things sub specie eternitatis. So I guess what I'm wondering is, when Spinoza says that the adequate idea is itself an act of understanding, and that it has, you're understanding something sub specie eternitatis, how do you understand an adequate idea of the Pythagorean theorem sub specie durationis? Like, I mean, sorry, you may have already answered this.
I think that was also Dan's question, and I didn't have a chance to answer it. And it's a great question. My hunch is that Spinoza answers this question in part 2, proposition 40, scholium 2. A mathematical fact can be conceived adequately through its causes, but you can also grasp it in a more durational way through memories, for example.
Okay.
Or so when I conceive of the Pythagorean theorem without understanding the proof, then I have a fragmentary idea of the Pythagorean theorem, and that would be an inadequate idea, a temporal idea of something that is
right. But could you? I mean, if you're building a machine and you need to like cut some metal, and you need the Pythagorean theorem for that, like how are you thinking about that Pythagorean theorem in that operation?
If the engineer doesn't have the proof, and they may not need the proof, of course, then their idea is incomplete, and it's an inadequate idea.
But then if they do have if they're thinking of it sub specie eternitatis, I guess I'm just wondering, like, sorry, just say what you want to say.
I should also add that I think you can't gain adequate ideas. So your mind is already a collection of adequate ideas, some of which are clouded over by prejudices and illusions. So I agree with Eugene Marshall that adequate ideas are in some sense innate, although the word innate, I don't know if it's such a useful term, but they're, learning isn't a matter of gaining an adequate idea, it's a matter of changing your perspective on an idea you already possess.
Okay, cool. Well, we can return to that. I just want to make sure I get to Colin, and then actually, I'll go to Chris Martin since he hasn't talked in this session, and then, sorry, Colin, come back to you. To Chris.
So this might have been covered, Rafi, but I wonder if you might increase the need and size of the shifting perspective by saying that, well, my question is this: is my idea of the Pythagorean theorem really adequate without connecting that with the whole of geometry that theorem builds upon, feeds and is nurtured by, and nourished by? And I want to say there's somewhere where I had the sense that for Spinoza, an adequate idea can only be adequate if everything in which it was involved with was included. That's clearly not the case for the Pythagorean theorem, but understanding the Pythagorean theorem just as in isolation via Euclid is clearly better than what we might learn fixing cars, I don't know, something, right? So I wonder if everything would be in a shifting area, because we can never quite have the genuine eternity. We never really quite have the true temporality. And so the shifting would be needed because, well, that's where almost everything or everything might be. But then if everything is there, that might be a worry as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this shifting perspective might turn out to be very significant. And we can see this when we look at George Eliot's translation. Curley translates the scholium as, let's consider the mind as though it were beginning to understand things under the aspect of eternity, as we have done up to this point. And that makes it sound like what we're doing is we're imagining a mind as beginning to adopt the eternal perspective, the same perspective that we have occupied. In other words, we've always been occupying the eternal perspective, but let's for a moment consider a mind as though it were adopting that perspective. But if you look at the Latin, the clause, as we have done up to this point, does not attach to the idea of considering the mind under the aspect of eternity. What Spinoza is saying, I think, is that we will consider the mind as shifting as we have done up to this point. And that comes through more clearly in George Eliot's translation. So in other words, there's a certain perspective which he later calls a fiction. And he says, let's occupy that perspective as we have done up to this point. So what he seems to be saying there, and it's alarming and strange, is that this fictional orientation is actually one that we have occupied for a while. And of course, George Eliot is a little bit more live to this, maybe. It seems like Spinoza is saying large parts of the ethics are in some sense fictional because they occupy this middle standpoint.
What would be an example of something that was purely temporal?
I think the way I want to think about it, I'm well aware that there are other ways of analyzing it, and I don't mean to present this as like the one true interpretation. But one interpretation that gives me a sense of control over the text is this. There are certain entities that are eternal, period. There are other entities which are temporal, period. These entities are aspects. But once we recognize that aspects they're distinct entities, so they can differ without contradiction, and Spinoza does posit relations of sameness between them, but those aren't identity relations, they're just sameness relations, and sameness and identity are distinct. So once we have all that in the back of our minds, then we can say there are certain entities which are temporal, period. So for example, an inadequate idea is temporal, period. You as an actually enduring being, that's the Chris that we encounter in everyday life is that temporal being is temporal, period. That same being is one and the same as a certain eternal essence, and this temporal being and the eternal being are different aspects of the same thing. But your durational side is a perfectly temporal being. It doesn't participate in any way in eternity. Just as your mental side doesn't participate in any way in extension.
Colin?
Thanks. So one of the reasons that I'm like struggling to understand this middle ground is like, it feels like the shifting perspective should somehow like mediate or connect the two other perspectives, But if we're really just like talking about like three discrete entities, it's like, then I just don't understand how it's like shifting, mediating, or uniting the other two. Like it feels a little bit like there's some problem analogous to the one you run into reading Descartes. If you think of the three primitive notions of mind, body, and union as like principal attributes in their own right, or like three different kinds of substances. And it's like, okay, what holds those together? So I guess I kind of want to know, like, in what sense is the shifting perspective shifting or connecting the two other perspectives?
It's a really good question. So, you know, if you can see something as changing color from red to blue, then presumably you can see it as red and you can see it as blue. Similarly, if you can see something as changing from temporal to eternal, presumably you can see it as temporal and you can see it as eternal. So this shifting perspective should be able to represent temporal things and it should be able to represent eternal things. So the shifting perspective should be able to represent the perspective of time, which is a temporal thing, and it should be able to represent the perspective of eternity, which is an eternal thing. And if that's so, then as you suggest, Colin, this shifting perspective is a kind of meta perspective that we could use to understand the other perspectives. But a point I bring out in the paper is the eternal perspective knows nothing of the temporal perspective, and the temporal perspective knows nothing of the eternal perspective. So those two perspectives can't see each other. I call that the time-eternity barrier. But this meta perspective can see both.
Okay, so I'm going to worry about that in two ways. So if this shifting perspective sees both, then I worry that it's going to see the inconsistent properties. And then I'm going to worry that you're going to get like these inconsistent properties crashing into each other from the meta perspective. Then my second worry is like earlier you suggested that like the aspect talk was really the right way to think about your view. And so now I don't know how to translate this meta all-encompassing perspective talk into the aspect talk that you suggested was like the better form of expressing your view. So two worries there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think that you're right, and I do think that suggesting that this shifting perspective is a meta perspective that can see the other perspectives does introduce the problem that you've just identified and other problems. So I'm not totally sure about it. It would be nice to say that there is some kind of meta perspective that sees all the information. It may very well be that Spinoza just can't really be made totally coherent on this issue. And if you're philosophically creative enough, as I think you are, you can see how he does get it twisted into knots. But it's a really, really, really useful point. If the meta perspective sees both aspects, then doesn't that mean that the entity has two contradictory properties at once? You know.
Right, Dan?
I want to return to something that you said a little bit earlier as to one of the differences between my reading and your reading, which is you want to say you can look at the mind either entirely temporally or entirely eternally. But you resist wanting to say that a part of the mind is eternal and a part of the mind is temporal. But look at Proposition 38 of Part 5, the demonstration. And let me read a few lines of that. Mm-hmm. The mind's essence consists in knowledge. Therefore, the more the mind knows things by the second and third kind of knowledge, the greater the part of it that remains. And consequently, the greater the part of it that is not touched by affects which are contrary to our nature. And then he goes on to say in the Scholium that death is less harmful to us the greater the mind's clear and distinct knowledge, and hence the more the more the mind loves God. Now, one can argue here that he's not, when he's talking about the greater part of it that remains, he's not talking about eternal truths. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that that is the most reasonable way of
think he is, yeah.
Reading that, in which case, I mean, he uses the word part, pars, in Latin. The greater part of the mind that is eternal, it looks like.
I think that, so it sounds like there's two challenges. One is that he says that the mind can become more eternal, and,
right.
and a greater part of it can be eternal. And the second problem is this language of parts, which seems to contrast with the aspectual reading. Surely the intellect is a part of the mind, in the same way that, a seat is part of a car, or something like that. My brief responses would be, first of all, that in order to solve the problem of how passions can become actions, the aspectual perspectival reading seems to do well there. When I transform my passions into actions, I'm becoming more eternal. So my sense is that whenever Spinoza says that we're becoming more eternal, or whenever he seems to be committed to such a claim, he is suggesting that from a certain shifting perspective, the mind appears to be becoming more eternal. Is that
when I learn geometry, aren't I becoming more eternal as well?
It's a good point. I guess he's got to say that it's a merely apparent change, which appears to be the case from the shifting perspective. From the eternal perspective, you already know all the math. So he's at least pushed towards this perspectival analysis, even of education. It does sound a little crazy. I agree.
It would have been a great help when I was studying math in college.
Right, you already are free of sadness. That's why he says God is not the cause of sadness, because in fact, once you understand the sadness, you'll see it's not real. A similar thing can be said about ignorance of mathematics. God is not the cause of ignorance of mathematics, because that ignorance is not really there. It's just something that seems to be there from an ordinary perspective.
I'm going to insert myself in the queue since no one else is on it. I'm going to do the annoying Spinoza's thing of being like, well, what about this proposition? But so when you get an adequate, you just said that from the eternal perspective, we already know all the math. So when we have adequate ideas, that's when we have this complete understanding. We already have all the adequate ideas. So when we're learning math, we're just sort of like shaking away all of the distracting imaginative notions that are getting in the way, something like that. But then how do you explain like 2p43 or a proposition like that? So as soon as you know that you know, you're certain, so how do you explain that? From what perspective is that happening? Or how do you explain that passage where he seems to suggest that if you have an adequate idea, you have an adequate idea, you know what you need to know, you're certain.
Well, the first thing I should say is that I find that proposition inspiring because it suggests that Spinoza is open to the kinds of infinite nesting that I posit. I'm not yet sure why that proposition would prima facie present a challenge to my reading, and I guess I'm curious to know more. From the eternal perspective, I know that I know that I know, etc. It's not. Oh, that's not a claim about having consciousness of knowledge, right? When you enter the math class, totally ignorant of Euclid, you already know the Pythagorean Theorem unconsciously, and you know that you know it unconsciously, and so on. That knowledge doesn't necessarily register in any kind of conscious way.
Okay, so you'd have to read 2p43. It's just like you know unconsciously. So it's not really about sort of a conscious apprehension of your own knowledge and appreciation of it.
I think Spinoza does seem to be committed to that claim. After all, he seems to be committed to the claim that we adequately know all kinds of things, although we might be unconscious of it. For example, we have an adequate idea of God, although we're not always conscious of that idea. But by 2p43, everybody innately knows that God exists and knows that they know and knows that they know that they know. Although there are, of course, plenty of atheists. They're just in possession of all of this infinite knowledge of God, but it's somehow clouded by prejudice and illusion.
Oh, so Chris Martin wants to jump in.
Yeah, I have a maybe. So obviously, I need to learn more about aspects, but maybe you could help me out. And I'm thinking with the substance mode relation problem, right? So for the longest time, it's been unclear exactly how in Spinoza we can have temporal finite durational modes from God, right? That's a big, deep, long question. And at first I was thinking, you know, boy, your view might really kind of help with this in any way. But then I was sort of thinking, I think you addressed this in your paper more, well, maybe for your view to get off the ground, you have to presuppose the temporal modes in order to have grist for the mill to talk about. So my question is, could you say something more about the aspects and whether they need to presuppose finite temporal modes, or whether they might help us to understand better the transition from substance to finite temporal modes?
Rafi, you should unmute yourself.
About the question, I think, Chris, can you say a little more about it? I think I'm not yet on. So there is this transition between substance and modes in 1p15, 1p16. Is that what you have in mind?
Well, no, the thing I have in mind is that Spinoza notoriously doesn't exactly tell us how finite modes are possible. We know that finite modes come from other finite modes. We maybe know how infinite modes, so-called, can follow from God, right? Different sort. But he never really tells us how it is that we can have this world of finite modes. And the acosmism issue that, you know, recently popular, it's more forceful than people think. I think this is a real problem for Spinoza. And so when I was looking through your paper and listening to the talk, I was thinking, this might help us to smooth the transition in some way from substance to finite and temporal modes. But the more we've been talking about it, the more I've been thinking that maybe Rafi's position seems to presuppose this, so it doesn't quite help. And not a big deal if you don't help it, but I'm wondering, could this position help us out to understand how we can have finite temporal modes, or is that just something that needs to be postponed for another problem?
I think that I think my interpretation at least does have a way of answering this question. And the question is, why is there finitude? Why are there imperfections? Why is stuff broken? Since the world began with a perfect being that can only create other perfect things, why is there any finitude or imperfection? This is a version of a traditional problem in medieval Islamic philosophy, sometimes called the particularization problem. Like, why are there particular things? My answer would be, bring in the perspectives. Finite things exist from the finite perspective. Eternal things exist from the eternal perspective. So in fact, eternal things do not give rise to finite things. And that's something that comes out again in Kristin's work. I think this is right. I don't know if you still hold this view, Kristin, but if something is eternal, its causes, its effects also have to be eternal. And Spinoza seems to depend upon that inference when he's talking about intellectual love. When he's talking about intellectual love, he calls back to a point he made about causation, and he says, well, A is eternal, A causes B, therefore B is eternal. So an eternal God does not actually literally produce any durational things. So why do they exist? Where do they come from? Well, they exist just from a certain vantage point. And so there aren't really these straightforward causal relations between the two. And this is something that the acosmist readers noticed, right? Then you have this problem. Well, hang on a second. You've just said that there's finitude from a crappy vantage point. But where does the crappy vantage point come from? Surely it must be real. And I think one of the interpreters just kind of like stops developing the point there. But it does seem that this seems like a problem for the idealist reading, right? There seems to be finitude only from a certain finite perspective. That is a really paradoxical claim. And my whole program kind of comes out of like worrying about that. Like, what would it mean to say that there's a certain illusion which exists only from a perspective which is itself some kind of illusion? And that's what leads me to say that these perspectives are infinitely nested or infinitely iterated. Highly paradoxical, but I think it's almost coherent. I try to give an argument that it's actually coherent to say that a certain perspective exists only for itself. That's, I think, one of the things that's hardest for me to do in the paper, to show that that's cogent. And I try to do it.
Colin?
I am sorry for being annoying.
No, be it.
I'm just really struck by the way that you're kind of like switching back and forth between different terminologies. So in this like back and forth with Chris, it was all about like what is true from a given perspective. And as you're talking, I was like translating everything back into aspect talk. And if you think like, hey, look, there are all kinds of things that have multiple aspects. Some of them are finite, like temporal aspects. Some of them are eternal aspects. And I guess like the temporal aspects and causal relations with the other temporal aspects, but not the eternal aspects. I just feel like the problem looks very different then. Like there isn't the kind of like the rampant threat of illusoriness, so long as we're careful to translate all this perspective talk into aspect talk, as the way you encouraged us to do earlier. Which makes me wonder whether you are more committed to thinking of these aspects as sort of like representation dependent somehow.
It's really, really helpful. I really appreciate you bringing that out.
Rafi, you can always appeal to the time running out if you need to.
How appropriate to appeal to the finitude of time to avoid one of Colin's objections to my paper on eternity. Colin, I really like that point. And if you're right, then maybe the aspectual reading is even easier to rescue without the apparatus that I've introduced. I'll have to think about that some more. Thank you all so much for your comments and alternatives.
All right, well, let's all thank Rafi. And then we have some concluding comments.
Can we move into the eternal perspective now?
So thanks everyone for joining us for this conference. Normally we'd ask you to or invite you to continue the conversation over drinks and dinner, but can't do that now obviously. But we thought about ways to continue the conversation asynchronously. If you have a hallway moment, if you have further things you'd like to add to any of the papers, on the website there's a comment section. You can add a comment. Authors will have a chance to respond to comments. We will try to circulate the edited video and transcript, but also written comments from the authors if they have additional things to say. So you can continue the conversation, just not in person. We'll be doing this again tomorrow with another slate, so I hope to see many of you there. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Nice seeing you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
All right, so that went smoothly enough.
I think so. I'm going to stop recording.
Sure.